Good morning and welcome to the Valencia eSports Congress, powered by Twitch. My name's Paul Chaloner. Some of you may know me by the name of Redeye. We are coming live all across the world right now from Valencia, the ferry of Valencia. It's great to be here. We've got the Valencia DreamHack coming up over the weekend as well, so it's a real weekend of eSports. I guess today is about a number of things. Firstly, it's great to have so many people here from industry leaders, games developers, gamers, team managers, sponsors, a real range of people from the media as well, and being brought together for really the first time in a really big way. And it's great to have those people here. You're going to see some amazing panels today. We've got the tough questions to ask them as well. They've all been prepared, and hopefully we'll have a really productive day. If nothing else today, and I've heard a lot of criticism about this out on the internet, some of which is valid, and it's a fair point. We weren't able to get absolutely everyone here in the room. We'd need a huge conference hall for that. But hopefully this will be the start of something great over the next few years. Esports certainly needs people to come together, and this will hopefully fuel that very positive statement. To start with this morning, the guys from DreamHack have asked me to do a keynote speech. Now, I have to tell you, I've never done a keynote speech before, and this is actually probably more nervous for me than doing crowds of people, except hopefully you guys aren't going to get me to do the Gangnam Style dance. Okay, so I thought, how do I do this? Originally, the organizers here at DreamHack Valencia asked me to kind of explain a little bit about my history, my road to where I am now as a professional host and commentator. And I thought, well, that's pretty boring, talking about myself for half an hour. So what I've done instead is tried to pick out a few key moments in history of esports that relate to how I got where I am and how many of the commentators and hosts in the business got to where they are right now in 2012. So if we kick off, this actually goes all the way back to the very early times. This is 1947. And you might think, hang on, is Redeye really going to try and pull this off? Esports started in 1947? No, I'm not. But without this guy, Thomas Goldsmith, inventor of the first CRT game, we might not have what we've got now. So this guy is kind of like the god of esports, the true god. He invented something that allowed people to have a very simplistic game through a cathode ray tube, and that's where we started. It did move on a little bit though, and very quickly by the late 60s and the 70s, already we had Pong, and Atari were made, and things started to become a bit more organized. And this is the late 60s and 70s. We think of esports very modern, and of course this isn't an esport, but it was two-player, and that was the start of things to come. We also had TCP and IP, which was invented in the early 70s, and it came along at a time when there was no internet. There was no real networks as such, apart from in the very big military institutions across America. And so the invention of this kind of stuff is important. It's a landmark, because without this stuff, we wouldn't have things like Battle.net and clients and things to be able to connect to. So it's an important part of our history and our heritage. By the late 70s, we started to see the first real games, the first arcade games, the first ones that we really got, dare I say it, addicted to. Many a 10-cent or 25-cent coin or a 10 pence piece, as it was for me back in the day, were spent playing this in the arcade, Space Invaders, 1978. Probably a really seminal mark in our video gaming history. Again, not a fantastic point in the sand for esports, because, again, it was just the arcade machines. But even this had two-player. It was all about beating the other guy's score. Next up, though, it was what many call the golden age of gaming. The late 70s and the early 80s came about, and programming improved, processor power improved, and with it, developers and game producers, they became who they are right now. This is where they made them. Some of these games were made in bedrooms across the world. Some of the most famous games, in fact, were made in bedrooms. One or two people working on them. I'm sure there's a few classics there that you can pick out. My personal favourites, Pole Position at the top. Spy Catcher, anyone? There's also International Karate in there. There's the classics like Paperboy and Outrun, Puzzle Bobble, Donkey Kong, and a whole host of others. And these things were, massively popular in arcades everywhere, but we hadn't really started to see them come into people's homes until the 1980s, maybe 182 with the Dragon 32 and the Spectrum and the Commodore 64 and the VIC-20 and what have you. And once we started seeing that happen, people became more interested in playing together and against other people. And I'm going to blow your mind right now. I might blow your mind anyway, so stay tuned for this one. This might well be the first ever offline tournament. It was for Space Invaders in 1980. So when we think of eSports and we think of it as being a fairly new phenomenon, actually these guys were playing in 1980. Many people in eSports weren't even born in 1980. I particularly like the wooden TV sets. I also think it's worth pointing out in that picture, it's a seminal moment in video gaming tournament history. There's a crowd. Again, we sort of talk about crowds today as something that is a fairly new phenomenon, but we've been seeing crowds forever. This goes back to 1980. And there were genuinely people interested in standing behind people playing Space Invaders. It's an interesting mark. Some of you may know this man as well. He was the first kind of video game superstar as a gamer, Billy Mitchell, a man who scored the most impressive mark on Pac-Man in 1982. The figure was 3,333,360 points, a perfect score. And he's in the record books to this day. Later on in the 90s, he came back and he did it in Donkey Kong. Not quite a perfect score, but he got the high score. And then there was some controversy about him losing it. But he was officially, for me, probably the first video game superstar. It's an interesting moment. During the 80s, things started to move on. People really wanted to play with each other. They wanted to play against each other. They wanted to play humans. The bots were great. Games were getting more impressive. But beating the game had become something that was fairly normal. Pac-Man, for instance, you could get the perfect score, and it had been done many times. But by the late 80s, people were really interested in playing against other players. And this might well be the first ever, or one of the first, networked games. 16 players. It was called NetTrek. It was kind of like a shooter RTS kind of hybrid. In today's term, it was like Quake meets StarCraft. Can you imagine that in your mind? It's quite mind-blowing. 16 players over a network before the internet even began. And this game is still played today. Amazingly. You can go and find it. It's on the internet right now. And then we moved into the 90s. And the 90s heralded a time where eSports began to find its roots and began to take off. And it did so through a number of different games. Not just these games either. These are just a small smattering of the amount of fantastic games that came out in the 90s. Graphics improved. CPU power improved. Networks improved. The internet came alive. And suddenly people were able to play against each other. The things they wanted to do in the 80s but couldn't do unless someone like Microsoft came along and put 15,000 wooden televisions in a room for them. Some of these games are still played today. They're still well loved. They're where I personally cut my teeth on many of these games in 1995, amazingly. And then you might ask, what is a Ferrari 328 GTS doing in an eSports presentation? Alex from Navi knows. It's an interesting point, and I use this slide for demonstration purposes because, for me, this is where it really began. This is where eSports really took hold of what we know it to be right now. In 1995, Microsoft came along, and they were really pushing Windows, and nothing changes sometimes, hey? And they wanted to get gamers to show off what they could do. And actually, at the time, no one had organized an offline eSports events the way that Microsoft decided to do it. And they held what they called Deathmatch 95. And I think for me, there were plenty of other tournaments before that, small scale, but this was the first time a really big tournament had been put together and played on a LAN. Thresh was the winner of that tournament, a man called Dennis Fong, who went on to do great things in esports and video gaming, has made an awful lot of money over the years as well, and was also a bit of a hero of mine at the time because he was kind of like the god of Quake and Doom and Hexen. He played in 11 tournaments, and he won all 11 tournaments. I don't think we'll see the likes of that again. And in 1997, John Carmack from id Software stood up and he said, you know what? These tournaments are good fun. We're going to hold one, and we're going to call it Red Annihilation. And you guys are going to battle to win my car. That was John Carmack's car, a 328 GTS. I think it was about 10 years old at the time. And inevitably, Thresh went along to the tournament, wiped the floor with everyone, and he won the Ferrari. And for many years, Thresh kept that Ferrari in the headquarters of his business. I think he recently sold it. But it is a point in time for esports, I think, which is really important. It's the first time that a major prize of any kind had been offered to video gamers. And suddenly, people started to be turned on to the fact that esports could be something viable for them to actually play at the weekends and make some money. And that led to a whole plethora of companies coming up, being born, the first of which CPL through Angel Munoz. And like him or love him, he was one of the first to really try and professionalize esports in the late 90s. 1997, 15 years ago. And it spawned a lot of other things as well. There were more leagues than even I can mention on this slide, but in general, there were offline leagues in Europe, in Asia, in North America, and of course, importantly, in Korea. It's quite a good time to talk about Korea as well. You'll notice in these slides that I don't talk about Korea as much, and that's mainly because in a solar system, Korea is like its own planet. It has its own set of rules when it comes to esports. You can't compare it, or at least you couldn't compare it perhaps until this year, with anything that we do in the Western world or the other side of the world, frankly. So I have, on purpose, kind of left Korea out. But it's an important area to remember of their growth and their development and what that's meant to the Western world as well. This one's a bit of a shaky picture. This guy is like the godfather of shoutcasters. Radarazniki and two other guys who joined together to form what they called the Tribes Shoutcast Network. Back in 99, maybe 2000, I think. And I'm doing this pretty much from memory because I can't remember that far back. But all I know is these three guys started doing Tribes, and they figured out that they could use Winamp and a Shoutcast plugin that people use to do radio streams to bring video game commentary to people. What a cool idea. It's like video game commentary on the radio. This is like 99, 2000 time, I think. So these guys were the forerunners for what I do now and what all of the other shoutcasters do now in the world. And it's where that term comes from. It's where shoutcaster came from. It wasn't a terminology for gamers as such. It was actually just a name for someone who did shoutcast radio. And so we owe a lot to this guy. He might not know it, and I'm sure right now he's thinking, where the hell did Redeye get that picture from? And that's the only one I can find of him, which I think is quite sad. But for me, this is about pointing out who the great people were, who the people that really blazed a trail for the likes of the rest of us to come through and do what we love. And this guy was very important in that. Some of you may know this guy. I count him as a personal friend. I'm very honored the fact that I worked with him for so many years. He's, of course, DJ Wheat. And around 2001, 2002, he started the journey just like I did. And very similar journeys, actually. We were both in clans. We were both playing at a fairly decent level. I wouldn't call it a high level. I sort of roped onto the end of 4 good teammates and played in a top team, and they carried me along for a while. I think Wheat was probably a little bit more successful than I was, certainly in Quake 3. And his team wanted to go to Europe, to the ESWC, and he had to stay behind. That was pretty sad. But as a sort of thing to try and follow it, he started shoutcasting. That's how he got into it. Me, I got into it through Clanbase. Clanbase guy came to me one afternoon and he said, Redeye, you play Unreal Tournament, do some shoutcasting. And my response was, what the hell is shoutcasting? I had no idea. I didn't know what it was, how you did it, or how you set it up. And fortunately, through some friends and some very technically gifted people, they were able to set me up with headsets and Winamp and do some stuff like that. And off I went, drunkenly casting Unreal Tournament, threatening people that if they didn't cap a flag soon, I'd take a tequila shot. That didn't end well. I think it was 6-5 in the end. And that's how this thing kind of started for us, for me, for Wheat, for a number of other shoutcasters at the time. We were unpaid, we were unprofessional, we didn't care. We were just having fun, and we were providing a small service to a group of people that loved their game. And that's pretty much how all of us started out. This guy also started out very similar. He was a top StarCraft player in the US, Tasteless, a man that I met in 2005 for the first time, at his first big tournament, by the way. And he's come through the same roads. He's not going to like me, by the way, for that picture. That's a personal picture that's never been seen before from the archives of Redeye. And he won't thank me for it, so sorry, Nick. But he started very similarly. You know, he played the game, he loved the game, he was into the community, and he wanted to talk about it. And he knew how to talk about it. He knew how to articulate about his game and put that passion into words. And he did that from 2005. So some of these guys have been around for a long time already. And 2005 is a really good marker for me as well, because it's the time when we switched from being sort of amateurs on radio and making a bit of a hash of it, frankly, to starting to work towards becoming more professional and have professional broadcasts. This was shot in 2005. This is our sum total of our production kit in 2005. It was the first time we did video with a company called Inside the Game, which Marcus and a few other very clever people set up on the back of being in TSN. And when we went to the Electronic Sports World Cup in 2005, this is what it looked like. It was the first time we'd done video online. 2005. This is when internet charges were still being made on your telephone. This is when we had no major ADSL across the world. And this is when we could only stream in standard definition at 384K. And yet, thousands of people still tuned in, and they loved it. They thought it was fantastic. Until we got DDoSed, which became a thing, which I'm glad to say that has changed. But in 2005, we had no Twitch, we had no owned, we had no servers. And I'm not trying to make this sound like we were poor, but we pretty much were. We didn't get any money to be doing this. We flew all over the world, and that was fantastic, and I was really thrilled to go and see new countries. But we didn't get paid, and very often we actually flew ourselves out to tournaments on the back of the fact that we wanted to be there. We wanted to be involved with the players. We wanted to bring that action to the people back home. It was very much a labour of love. There weren't many people making money from it. In fact, I don't think there was anyone making money from it in 2005. And there's a very old picture. That's the ITG crew from 2005 in Singapore, one of my personal favourite events I've ever attended at WCG. And it marks a moment in time for us because it became at the end of that year, we'd had a fantastic year as a commentary team. TSN had really flourished as well with their work with the CPL. And suddenly we had two very big, viable companies working on tournaments, still with no real business model, still with no real professionalism. We were still learning as we went. But slowly but surely we were getting better. Production values were going up. Internet streaming was getting better, even if it was ridiculously expensive. And we'd begun a road towards roughly what we've got now. And then into 2006. And this picture is it's important because although it's from a tournament that no longer exists, it sort of demonstrates where we were at that point. This for me was the first time we kind of put players on stages and shot them, but let's be honest, that looks like shit. And it looks bad because, well, it was bad, but it was the first time we'd really started to think about the players are the stars. The players are the ones that should be on the stream more. It's not about the commentators, it's not about the crowd, it's not about the spectators, it's not about the tournament organisers, or even the sponsors, dare I say it. All of those things are important and they all come together to make eSports what it is. But really, ultimately, it's about the players. And finally, we were starting to put the players on stages, albeit a little bit haphazardly. 2006 was also a fairly seminal year for my own progress in eSports. This is the Electronic Sports World Cup. And having attended that event, I found myself at a bit of a crossroads, as did many of the shoutcasters at the time. We'd started to become more professional. Some of us had gone back to college and learnt broadcasting. Some were blessed with just natural skill, people like DJ Wheat and Warwich. But actually it became a borderline job. So we had a decision to make. Funnily enough, some of us are making that decision again in 2012. Is eSports suddenly becoming so big that we can actually make a living from doing something we love? And that's what every shoutcaster kind of dreams about and did back in 2006. And at the end of that year, without giving you a sob story, I was at a crossroads. I'd spent a year out from finance and law. I'd been paid off for a year, having been made redundant the previous year and allowed to travel the world. I'd funded pretty much myself with some help from a company called GGL. And I'd got to the end of 2006 and me and my partner and my children were pretty broke. And with family and responsibilities, you need to earn the pennies. So I had a decision to make. Either I go back into financial stuff and be bored for the rest of my life, but at least pay the bills, or carry on trying to do something I really loved, but with the potential that we'd probably be thrown out onto the street. And in the end, that became a no-brainer, and I decided to go back to finance at 2006. Luckily, for me, things changed a little bit in 2007. And I got into a lot of trouble for this photograph of my woman at the time. A lot of trouble. And can you see how awkward I look right now? I really didn't want to be there, did I? And in 2007, things changed for me on a personal level, and they changed across the industry in eSports. We had the Championship Gaming Series come along. DirecTV with allegedly $50 million worth of funding. They were ready to take eSports to the next level, and I was ready for it as well. I wanted this. I think all of eSports wanted it. And so it's a point in time, it's a line in the sand for me. It was a time when I could actually stop worrying about money. I could be paid for doing what I love to do, and set up a company called Quad V, and stream other games as well, and keep doing other tournaments, keep doing ESWC and WCG and QuakeCon and all of the other great big tournaments across the world. CPL still going in 2007. And so the CGS offered a chance for a lot of people to become professional, not just me, but reporters, media, other shoutcasters, hosts, gamers, earning a real salary. And those things, those fundamental things, are fantastic. You can't take that away from what the CGS was. Yes, you can criticize the format. Yes, you can criticize the game choices. Yes, you can criticize how they wasted money. What you can't take away is what they gave to the gamers. They finally legitimized gaming in mainstream TV, probably for the first time on a regular basis. 2007 was also a time when gamers, famous gamers, started to think, wait, maybe I could make a living out of it. Maybe I can transfer my skills from gaming to become a commentator. It's not unheard of in sports, after all. We see plenty of ex-players playing all over the world, whether it be NFL, John Madden, or whether it be football stars in the UK. We see them going into commentating and punditry. And Fatality was no different. He joined us on the CGS for the first time, right at the end of what it was actually turned out to be the end of his gaming career, to see if he could do shoutcasting. And around at the same time, we did some UK shows with a chap that you might know of called Too Good, who I managed to get him his first gig on UK TV, and he's never looked back since. So it was a really interesting year for us as shoutcasters and as hosts. And the CGS, again, is kind of like one of those moments. As I said before, you can't really disagree that things were different, and that the things that they were trying to do could have taken down eSports. I think some argue that actually it did take down eSports for a little while, and I'm not going to argue with you on that. But I think there are lessons that we can learn. The production values, for instance, in those shows was incredible. And we're seeing that now in the same shows that we kick out week after week, weekend after weekend, from all sorts of fantastic organisers in 2012. They had Mike Burks, a 12-time Emmy Award-winning producer, run that show. A man who'd done the Super Bowl, he'd done the World Cup, he'd done the Olympics, and he produced our show. He produced a show for eSports. And I found that very, very awesome. In 2008, obviously things came to a shuddering halt for the CGS, and they also came to a shuddering halt for me personally. It was a pretty tricky year. We lost a lot of TV contracts. Shoutcasters were starting to become more professional. We had DJ Wheat in a full-time position with the CGS and with GGL previous to that. A number of other shoutcasters starting earning money across the world. Tasteless and Artosis had gone off to Korea to start off a version in Korea. Pardon the pun. And Joe at ESL had started to carve out a niche for himself as well, along with Too Good. So people were starting to make money in the shoutcast industry, in the hosting industry. But 2008 saw the crash of CGS, it saw the loss of WSVG, CPL had gone by then as well, and many other tournaments had fallen by the wayside. And we had very little to be looking forward to in a positive way. Except for these guys, ESL and MLG started to become even more popular than they had before, and it started to grow and gain spectators and start to do the things that some of the things that were learnt about in the CGS before, and produce fantastic shows as well as great tournaments. And then by 2010, on a personal level, it was pretty much where I took a pause. I had some personal issues in my life. I separated from my partner. One of my children came to live with me, and that made things a little bit difficult to get to events. So WCG in 2010 was pretty much the last time I did a major event where I'd worked the whole year. I went back into a regular job, at least it was in eSports, with Heaven Media. And whilst I enjoyed that job, it still wasn't commentary, it still wasn't going out doing TV. And we had a little bit of a gap in terms of the hosting and shoutcasting. But one of the things I'm really proud about is that over the years, just like DJ Wheat took me under his arm and helped me and nurtured me and showed me how to do the job really well, I was able to pass that experience on to other people as well. and invite them to come out to tournaments. People like Apollo and Rivington here, who did WCG 2010 Grand Finals, was one of their very first big tournaments. And they're both fantastically talented and are both now full-time eSports commentators. And that is just a joy. Which brings us right up to date. You'll excuse me for skipping 2011 and 2010, but I wasn't around much. And I don't really know what went on. I stayed in touch a little bit, but this is what I do know. The arrival of people like Twitch and Owned has changed the industry. It's changed shoutcasting, it's changed hosting, it's changed tournaments, it's changed streaming, it's changed the way people look at us in esports. It's changed the way that gamers are portrayed. No longer are they the bedroom nerds of old that are sleep deprived, drinking too much caffeine. They are professional gamers. Finally, people are taking us seriously. And these guys have played their role in that, because without that streaming, we can't get that message out there. And the proliferation now of shows and tournaments and coverage and media is just mind-blowing compared to where it was even 3 years ago. And you go back to when I started 10 years ago, I was happy if I got a mention in a clan-based match report. It's come a long way. Some of you may know this guy as well. I'm going to own up to being a good friend with him, and he'll hate me for that picture as well. I don't think I've published that one either. This is Carmack from the ESL. And he, along with a load of other people like DJ Wheat, and a whole host of other people like Scoots and Slasher, and lots of people who have come from what we have been dubbed the old boys club, which I don't believe in, by the way, are now in prominent positions in esports to try and help us drive this video gaming phenomenon even further. And for me, that's great. We were all the old guard. We were in at the very beginning. We knew what the challenges were. We knew what we wanted to achieve, and we knew how good this thing could look. And finally, these people are being put in positions where they're able to do this full-time and make a difference to esports. And finally, a good set of casters on the screen there. That's like a who's who of shoutcasters and hosts. We come to the Valencia eSports Congress, a chance for us to sit down and discuss all of the last 17 years of esports, figure out where we've been, where we are, and where we're going next. I don't think we'll make many decisions this weekend, but I think conversations will happen, healthy conversations, healthy debates, and hopefully we can show the public just how serious but how passionate we are about esports. Thank you very much. Okay, that was like just going back in life there for a second. We're going to take a very quick break, and then when we come back, we'll have our first panel. For those of you watching on the internet, thank you for tuning in. You do not want to miss these panels. So in about 10 minutes' time, we'll have our first panel set up, and we'll start discussing where we are in esports. So make sure you come and join us. For those of you in the crowd, please feel free to take a quick break, and we'll see you in 10 minutes.